Hi guys, Evied here, bringing a bit of a different kind of video, different style, bit of an impromptu video if I'm honest. So I just finished playing Final Fantasy 15. Literally finished about 10-15 minutes ago. I probably would have started this sooner, but the ending cutscenes last for quite a while. And I feel like I really just wanted to talk about this game, because this game, as everyone knows, we have been waiting for this game for a very long time. And what a lot of people were wondering and a lot of people were worried about is whether this game would deliver. Previous Final Fantasy games, most notably 13 and then the sequels that followed, 13.2 and 13.3, were to most Final Fantasy fans a disappointment. I myself enjoyed the games, but I can agree that they weren't as good as their previous counterparts. After that, 14 obviously was an MMO, and 15 had been in the works for so long, and everyone was sitting here and thinking, is this game going to live up to the hype, up to the expectations that Square Enix is building for it? And to be honest, everyone else was kind of forcing themselves to build for it as well, because of how long we've been waiting for this game. And whilst I can't pretend it doesn't have its shortcomings, I have to personally say I think they did it. I think Square Enix finally, after all these years, made a game that was truly brilliant. And it's been a while since I've been able to say that for a Final Fantasy game because of the previous ones that we've had, but they crafted something here. Not just made, they crafted something that really took my breath away a little bit. They made a Final Fantasy that, funnily enough, it didn't feel like a Final Fantasy game. It felt like something completely different, something on a whole nother level. Because they basically took all the mechanics that Final Fantasy had, put it to the side and thought, let's make something new, let's make something different, let's make something really unique. You know, this was the first Final Fantasy game, to my knowledge at least, that it really started as an open RPG style. This is, of course, barring 12, but 12 was always that style. The gameplay was incredibly fun. Incredibly fun. You know, you cycle through all these different styles of weapons, you can use magic, but magic, I have to say, for me, magic was very underused. I think they wanted to try something a bit different. As I said, this is a game that they felt like they wanted to really push outside the box of what was known of Final Fantasy games, and one of the most known things, one of the things that I think is associated a lot with Final Fantasy is the use of magic. You know, the use of fire, Firaga, thunder, Thundara, Thundaga, Blizzard, Blizzara, Blizzaga, the classic three, and then of course Cure, Cura, and Curaga, which didn't actually, to my knowledge, appear in the game. I never once had the spell Cure or Cura. In fact, it was mostly just using items to heal HP and heal MP. The use of magic was more for Noctis's, who's of course the main character, his use of warping around the map, warping towards enemies. And it was a really nice, unique feature that of course hadn't been in previous games. The summons were once again completely different. So summons are quite funny because in Final Fantasy games, they, depending on how you build your characters, how you build the summons themselves, they can either make or break the game. Sometimes they can be completely useless. I remember actually playing 12, and when I first got the very first summon, Bilius, he was amazing. He was so much fun to use and to fight with. And then as you progressed later in the game, he became utterly useless. And I think that was always kind of the case with summons. But this time they wanted to do something different. They weren't just a group of deities that would follow you around and fight with you and do all this. There were only 6. 4 of which you could actually use. 2 of which I actually was able to use. Because they changed the system to essentially, these deities were almost like your get out of jail free card. If you were in a big bind, you'd have the option to summon, and it was different for various summons. They would appear and they would just inflict incredible damage. These amazing cutscenes, beautiful cutscenes, would take place, and I think, whilst I know quite a few people may be disappointed with the summons, for me, it encaptured and encapsulated exactly what summons should be in these kind of games. They shouldn't be something that you can just call forth whenever the hell you want and then watch them kind of get smashed apart or whatever, because it takes away from what they were. Especially in this game, they are gods, they are deities. So they're not just going to come down and fight with you. They'll come down and help you when you need it and just obliterate everything that stands in your way. The most common summon was Rama, who of course was in the demo and was seen in the cutscenes of the trailers and all that. Like I'd say it's probably the one god that everyone knew was coming. The new one summon that everyone knew was here. And he is the most easy to summon, and he is the most common, but every time he appears, just a little shiver went down my spine, because just of how breathtaking that summon was. It was something different, something that hadn't been in previous games. The game was fun, incredibly fun. The combat was unique, it was different, and so much more enjoyable to do than Final Fantasy 13. 13, there were times when I would get quite overleveled, and if I'm being completely honest, I would just hold down X, because I played it on the PS4, PS3 at the time. I would just hold down X on auto, and I would switch the channel. And this would be in most fights. And I would hold down X and just let them do what they did. 5 minutes, I'd come back, battle would be done, I would have won. It was a game where, yes, it had its difficulties, but if you were a high enough level, those difficulties didn't matter. Because you were strong enough and you were powerful enough to just take out anything that was in your way. And Final Fantasy 13 for me became almost completely about the story at that point, when that started happening. Because the gameplay itself just wasn't fun anymore. It wasn't fun. 15 never felt like that. 15, you always had to be paying attention. I think partly because of the fact it was made much more into an open world RPG, as opposed to a linear game that previous Final Fantasies have been. This being said, as the game does go on, it becomes more linear. It has to appease the story. But at the same time, you have an option to actually travel back in time and go back to that open world element, something I personally didn't do because I was very, very enthralled in the story. For me, I think the thing that really, really got me about this game is, surprisingly, the characters. Previous games, I feel like the protagonists have been quite, without use of another word, quite bland. Once again, I'm just referring to 13 again, because this was, other than 15, was the most recent game in the franchise. Lightning was cool. She was cool. She was badass, and she had a couple of hidden depths, but there wasn't really anything to her. And I feel her development from beginning to end, whilst it did develop, it wasn't anything incredible. It wasn't anything amazing. You couldn't sit there and think, wow, she has changed so much. This story, this character arc has really come round to an end. Ironically, I think that the character in 13 who developed the most was probably Hope, I would say. I'd say he really did. But here's the thing. Because 15 did something else which other games haven't done. It gave you one playable character. Just one. And of course other people would argue that that's not the case. Other games have done that when you really only have one playable character. For example, 10, whilst in battle you could use other characters, on the outer world, Tidus, or Tidus, however you say his name, was the only one you could control, because he was the main protagonist. Same with 7, Cloud was the only one you could control on the outer world, so he was the main protagonist. 8, it was Squall. 13, you could alter between them, so it was more, you could play any character you wanted, really. But 15, you couldn't control the rest of your party. Like, ever. You would do link attacks with them, and, you could tell them to do this, or you could tell them to do that, but that would be your character, the prince, Noctis. It would be him telling them to do something, whilst you actually control him doing something else. So this was the first one that really pushed that really had only one playable character. And I must admit that I myself was skeptical about this. One of the charms of Final Fantasy games for me has always been party adjustment, party switching. But that wouldn't have worked in this game. Because in order to really, I think, follow the story of Noct, you had to only play him. You had to. Playing his companions, Prompto, Ignis, Gladiolus, it wouldn't have worked. You would have been there watching Noct develop instead of experiencing the development. Because I think the thing, as I said, that really gripped me about this game was the characters and the character development. This once again, it was revolutionary in so many ways for Final Fantasy games, but it was the first one, I believe, in which all of your party knew each other, really knew each other. Now, I myself, I did a bit of watching before the game, so I'd watched the 5-episode anime, 10 minutes each, to give a bit of backstory to each one of the companions and Noct himself. And early on, as I started playing the game, I actually got round to watching Kingsglaive. And I'd say whilst I strongly believe you don't need to watch these to play the game. You don't need to. But if you do, it will add so much more depth, I think, to each character. It makes characters who, I think, unfortunately, get brushed over a bit in the game. You realise how prominent they really were. Biggest example I can think of is a couple of the antagonists, and I'm trying to avoid as many spoilers as I can, within reason. In Kingsglaive, there were a couple of antagonists who had real prominence, and in the game, if you're not paying attention, you don't realise that they're actually, in some cases, dead. And it surprised me, it really did. Even a character who you might think will have more of an impact and more prominence in the game winds up just fading away. And I'd be lying if I said at first this didn't annoy me a bit, because, you know, for me, whenever there is a main character, I like to know exactly what's happening with them. I don't know if that's mainly just for me watching shows like Naruto, in which they literally cover every single character, but I like to know where they're going, how their story arc is developing. And I feel like some of these characters were brushed under the rug. But at the same time, it added a sense of believability and realism, which is so strange to be saying when talking about a Final Fantasy game. But it added this sense of not everyone survives, not everyone dies in an epic way in which the main character would see it. Sometimes things will happen, especially when the antagonist is as good as they are, which I will get to briefly. Sometimes characters who you think might have more of an impact in games, they don't. They do just die. And it surprises and it shocks you. But it really, I think more than anything, it almost makes you appreciate not just those characters, not just the characters you're playing, but as I said, the main antagonist of the game. The fact that this character can make others look so meaningless. Characters who you thought were so much more important, it turns out they're not. And as I said, moving on to the main antagonist, I don't want to spoil who it is, but they might be one of my favourite antagonists from any game ever. Because it's a character who has a lot more depth to them than you realise. And I have to say it's something I think has been lacking in previous Final Fantasy games, that the final antagonists in previous games, in my opinion, have been some of the biggest letdowns. I'm thinking back, 13, if I'm not mistaken, it was Bartandalus and I forget the name of the other god he fused with. But whilst Bartandalus had a bit of depth, he was really always just about one thing, and that was just kind of, you know, he was a god, he wanted to rule, he wanted to destroy, and that was kind of it. And there were other characters in that game, in my opinion, that had a lot more depth and were a lot more interesting than him, but they were shafted for this almighty powerful thing. And I think that's a shame. I think that's what was the common factor in final bosses for these games, is that they decided that the final enemies, the final antagonists, were best suited as huge, powerful beings. Essentially, what you feel like they wanted to do was they wanted to make enemies that would make the game difficult right at the end, that would make the game really hard to beat and frustrate people, and in a sense really prolong the game, make it longer than it needed to be. The final boss battle in 15, I'm going to be honest, the game in general is not incredibly difficult. It's not a game which you think, oh, I'm done, I'm going to have to go back to the previous save point, because that's one thing as well. This is the first Final Fantasy game in which save points are gone. You can now save on the fly, and there's autosave. It's a miracle. This game wasn't incredibly difficult in the sense, if you came across really tough enemies, you could easily get away from them. Bosses in general, they were hard, but I found this game was very easy to ensure that you didn't lose. I only lost in this game once, and it was right at the end, and I actually did it on purpose because I was annoyed with myself. I was fighting a couple of quite tough enemies, and I got the option to summon, and I summoned something that I'd never summoned before, and I was really excited, so I paused the game, kind of braced myself, and then I accidentally skipped the cutscene for the summon. And in a rage, I was like, nah, enough. No, I'm not doing this now. And I let myself die. It was just silly, but the game itself isn't that difficult. You can complete the game. You don't. I never found myself sitting at a point thinking, I don't know how to progress now, which happened a couple of times in 13, where you would be thrown into these huge boss battles, incredibly difficult, grinding boss battles. Bartandalus was the biggest culprit of this. He was an absolute nightmare to fight, especially his first battle. I remember actually being stuck on Bartandalus in 13 for weeks, just weeks trying to beat this boss, and when I finally did, I was so happy. But it halted the game, and it makes it less enjoyable, and more than anything, it makes you want to stop playing the game. I mean, other games are guilty of this, not even in the Final Fantasy franchise, such as, I mean, Bloodborne. Bloodborne, when you first encountered Ludwig in the DLC, that boss was made to make people want to almost stop playing the game. And you can kind of forgive From Software because that's kind of their style. But Final Fantasy, it wasn't as fun. It wasn't so much, you wanted the challenge, because the thing is about games from Software is that their story is practically non-existent. It's very hidden. You actually, if you really want to know the story, you really have to go looking. You have to go digging. But Final Fantasy, for me, one of the main reasons I ever play these games is because I love the story. And when you're being halted, you're not being allowed to progress with the story because of bosses, it really ruins the experience for me. 15 didn't have this. 15's bosses were really manageable, actually. And I never actually, lost the game against these bosses, not even the final boss. But that was nice, because you can tell, I believe that was pretty much intentional. You know, they wanted it to be a challenge, and it was. The bosses were a challenge, but they were manageable. If you knew what you were doing, you knew how to play the game, it was easily manageable. And it didn't take away the story that was happening at the time. You know, I believe they knew that if they made these bosses incredibly difficult, you'd almost forget what the story was and be so focused on these bosses, and they didn't want to do that, and I really commend them for that. I really do, because I was really enthralled by this story. It confused the hell out of me at first, as does every Final Fantasy game. And there are still questions now, of course. Questions that I am going to go looking for. I intend to play this game more, even though I've completed the main story. I know there's still plenty more I can do, plenty more hunts, which is another feature that they've added. Because it is so much more of an RPG, side quests, free roaming, so much more prominent. Now, as a result, the main story of the game is shorter than previous. It is. It has to be. Just to keep your interest, I feel like it has to be. I was surprised at first when I started realizing I was coming to the end game a lot sooner than I thought I was. I was surprised and honestly at the time a little disappointed. I will be honest, it did, but then as I started getting towards the end game, I realized it worked. It felt right to be ending it where it was ending it. The story had come full circle, and it was at this time finally really making sense to me. And I think going back to the characters, Noct really came full circle. This game, for protagonists' character development, was one of the best in any Final Fantasy game. There's no denying that as far as I'm concerned. But not just Noct, but the three around him, Gladiolus, Ignis, and Prompto, really developed as characters. But more than anything, they really helped Noctis develop into the character he was. As I said before, this game was different in so many ways, but the fact that the four main characters knew each other very well from the get-go, and as I said, this is explained in even more depth by the anime episodes that they had before the game was released. This bond that these four had, for me, was arguably the best part about the game. Just seeing the connection they had, the development of each individual character, a development I wasn't expecting. Each character had their own struggles they had to overcome in different ways. Each character, whilst not necessarily being the main protagonist, you really felt a connection with them. After, very large-scale battles, there were injuries that really affected not just the character but the party, and you could see that. I feel like in previous games, if one of the characters had been injured, to the extent that some were in this game, you really wouldn't feel the same way as you do about the characters in this game, because there was a real sense of brotherhood in this game, and I think that was something that was really prominent and really, really nice, is there was a sense of brotherhood, and it made the end game so much more powerful, because of what happened, because of the way it ended up. the way it was crafted with these characters, and once again, I'm trying to avoid as many spoilers as I can for anyone who hasn't played it, but it really made you connect with each person, and it really made you understand why each character connected with each other the way they did. And I think more than anything, it really enthralled you in the story more than it would have if these characters weren't as strong as they were. Because when you get a game like this that is as large as it is, that is as beautiful as it is, because the graphics in this game, I have to say, are some of the best graphics I've seen in any game. And, you know, I come to expect that from Final Fantasy games, but even this, it blew me away. But when you get a game like this, that is this size and has all this to do, and has such a gripping story, the one thing that I think Final Fantasy has been lacking in so many previous incarnations is really strong individual characters. I think they have maybe one or two, but each character in this game, in Final Fantasy 15, was really, really strong. Really strong. You really knew something about them. You really got to know them as the game went on, because it didn't just throw you. I mean, it did. It didn't just. It put you in a position where all these characters knew each other and you didn't know the characters. So in that regards, it did throw you a little bit into it. But as the game goes on and the characters develop, that doesn't matter, because you feel like you're developing with the characters. And I think because of that, it made the ending of the game the most powerful ending, I think, ever in a Final Fantasy game. Ever, ever, ever. It was so powerful because of how you got to know all these characters. Final Fantasy 15 did it. It did it. It lived up to the hype. This is all my opinion. It lived up to the hype. It lived up to the expectations that many people had. And the thing is, I can't sit here and I can't say it is a perfect game. As much as I want to. It is a game that I have enjoyed to no end. It's one of the first Final Fantasy games in which I've been able to just sit down and just play it. And just play it and play it and not feel like I'm being halted at any part of the game. I don't feel like there's been a time where I've not wanted to play the game, where I've just gone, I don't really fancy it right now, I'll play it maybe some other time. I've wanted to play this game every chance I had, because the gameplay, the story, the characters, the graphics, all of it just grabbed me and it gripped me and it didn't let go. As to what I think the game was lacking, whether it was lacking or not, I don't know. I wish the game was longer. I really do. For me, what I would have loved to see, and it's funny because this is kind of contradicting what I said earlier, I would have loved to see more development of these characters who were just brushed under a rug. And whilst as I said, I understand why it was done, and I can appreciate I can appreciate why it was done. I do wish on another level that it wasn't, because I would have loved to see the development of these other characters. I would have loved to see more of them. And I think that the game started by, I'd say, probably by the 10th or 11th chapter, because there are 14 chapters in this game. I'd say by the 10th or 11th chapter, the game started to feel very rushed. But I think the reason for that is simple. When you get past, I'd say probably chapter 9, it loses its open worldness, and it becomes very linear like previous games have been, and focuses purely on the story. Now this doesn't bother me. This doesn't bother me at all, because that's, you know, it makes sense. I think the problem I had is that I was comparing the later chapters to the earlier chapters, when you had this open world element. And when that's suddenly taken away and you realise, oh, I can't go back and do this side quest like I thought I could, I have to just keep progressing with the story. That can feel a bit rushed. But I understand it. As I said, I understand why it was done. It had to be done, in my opinion. To really make the story what it was, it had to be done. But I would love just to see more development in some of these other characters. Because when you see what great development they've done in the main four in particular, and the main antagonist, when you see the amount of development they have, you really wish that they had done it for every character. This is the kind of game I feel like I could sit down and honestly play for hundreds of hours. And I didn't. I believe I beat the game after about 45 to 50 hours of gameplay. And you might be sitting there thinking, geez, that's incredible. That's a crazy amount of hours. Compared to games nowadays, yes, unfortunately it is. But compared, I would say, to previous Final Fantasy games, I don't know. Because the story itself, if you wanted to play the game purely for the story, you didn't want to do any of the side missions, you didn't want to do any of that, one, you'd be under-leveled as hell. But two, I'd say you could probably beat the game in about 20 hours. And I'd say previous Final Fantasies, you probably couldn't do that. Now, at the same time, I think that's partly because a level of artificial difficulty was created in previous games by the ridiculous bosses, which aren't in this game. But yeah, Final Fantasy 15 smashed it. For me, absolutely smashed it. I absolutely loved the game. And I am honestly looking forward to no end to playing more of it, to playing post-game, to exploring what else the game really has to offer. Exploring the side quests. And just appreciating the game for what it is. And that is just something phenomenal. Just something phenomenal. If I had to rate the game, and I'm not really one for doing this, I'm not really one for ranking games out of 10 or anything like that. And thinking about it now, I don't know if I could. Because every game is a different experience for a different person. You know, you might be hearing this review, and you might be thinking to yourself, I didn't really find all this with the game. I didn't really enjoy this. I actually didn't really like the character development. I didn't really like the characters, and of course that's fine. You know, that's your opinion. But for me, I'd probably have to give the game a 9 out of 10. And after saying that, even now I'm like, oh god, but there was this and there was that, because it's hard. It's hard to rank games like this because there's so many factors. I think for now, this is just because this is me literally after I've just finished playing the game. I would give it that ranking because of how the story really just ended for me, and just how well of a job I think they did with it. And, you know, do I think it was worth the wait? Absolutely. Absolutely. Final Fantasy 15 is a great game. A great game. Is it perfect? No, but that doesn't matter. No game is perfect. It can't be. The moment we get a perfect game, what's the point in making any more? If you haven't already, I implore you, give this game a go. If RPGs are your style, Final Fantasy is your style, if large open world games with gripping story, gripping characters, and really enjoyable gameplay is your style, give Final Fantasy a go. Final Fantasy 15. You could try some of the other ones, but they might not have all the things I just said. Because I've not felt this way after playing a game since I completed Bioshock Infinite. And that was a long time ago. That was a long time ago. You know, this is the first game in so long which I've sat down after finishing it and just reflected on it. And I feel like that's because such a strong connection was made with the characters, and it's a connection that I myself felt. I really did. So yeah, that is my review, recap of Final Fantasy 15, relatively spoiler free. If you guys all enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up, give it a like, smash the hell out of the like button, comment if you've played the game. Please let me know what you guys think of it. Did you enjoy it? How much did you enjoy it? Did you hate it? Why did you hate it? How did it compare to the previous games? And if you haven't played it, go for it. Just go for it. You won't feel any worse after playing this game, I'll tell you that right now. Thank you all. Like, comment, subscribe and share. And I love you all. And I'll catch you guys for the next video. Thank you, and goodbye.